In this final video, I'm going to talk about how the division between the national government and the state government is constantly being negotiated. And then following that, we'll talk about categorical versus block grants. So first, let's talk about the negotiations. As I've explained elsewhere, state governments control educational policy. They're the ones in charge of establishing educational policy. And yet, a few years back, when President George W. Bush was still in office, there was a program that was widely adopted across the country that was called No Child Left Behind. What No Child Left Behind did was it required all schools to take tests at certain times, at certain grades, and then the scores for the schools were used to assess their performance. Schools that performed poorly were given an opportunity to correct themselves. Schools that did well obviously were applauded for what they did. If a school did poorly for a long time, eventually the funding would be denied and there would be something done to improve the schools. This was a federal program. And when I talk about federalism, students back during that time would say, but wait a minute, that was a federal program. Why was the federal program affecting what was happening in states all across the country? Well, this is what happened. Every year, the federal government sets a budget. And in that budget, what the federal government does is it provides states with money for education. So even though education is the responsibility of the state, the federal government provides money in its federal budget to help schools, to help states pay for their education. Part of No Child Left Behind basically said, if you go along with the testing requirements in No Child Left Behind, we will give you this much money for education. But if you don't follow these requirements, then we will reduce the amount of money you're getting. Now, it's still the responsibility of the state to adopt educational policy. They're still the ones that are in charge of educational policy. But what do you think happened when the federal government passed a law that basically said, do the testing the way we've asked you to do it, or we'll reduce the money that you get? Well, of course, the states volunteered to adopt these federal standards. That's how the federal government frequently can get what it wants done with the states. Here's another example. State governments control the drinking age, right? There, again, remember those original questions that I asked when we were talking about whether something was under the federal or state power? Right? Does the Constitution give the federal government the authority to do something like set the drinking age? No. Does the Constitution prohibit states from setting the drinking age? No. Well, based on that, setting the drinking age is a power given to the states. This is the meaning of the reservation clause, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, in the same way that we were talking about education, what happens is every year the federal government provides states money for transportation, for roads and bridges and things like that. So this is what the federal government did. They noted that in states that had drinking ages lower than age 21, the likelihood of fatalities in traffic accidents was substantially higher. So what did they do? They passed a law that basically said to the states, hey, I'm paraphrasing. Hey, states, you're in charge of setting the drinking age. The Constitution gives you that authority through the 10th Amendment. So this is entirely up to you. But we want you to adopt the drinking age of 21. And if you don't, well, you can do that. That's your responsibility. But if you don't, we're going to reduce the amount of money we're giving you for transportation. If you do raise the drinking age, then we will give you additional money for transportation. And so, in fact, what did the states do? they raised the drinking age to 21. Once again, this is how the federal government oftentimes gets what it wants. The states do it voluntarily, although students often are bothered by that decision voluntarily or volunteered because it feels more like extortion. Now, this has been changing a little bit recently when the Affordable Care Act was passed. Now, this was a law that was passed during President Obama's administration. One of the things that the Affordable Care Act did is it required states to open up what were called exchanges. In California, it's called Covered California, where if you want to get health insurance, but you can't get it through your employer, you can go through the state's exchange and buy it there. And so what the Affordable Care Act said is, look, we give states money every year for health care. The Affordable Care Act required states to open up exchanges, all 50 states, or lose federal funding. Now, in that case, what happened is the Supreme Court stepped in and said, wait a minute, the Affordable Care Act is legal, but this part of the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, and it prohibited the federal government from denying funds to the states for not setting up these exchanges. And that's what I mean by the negotiation. In this case, the federal government tried to impose its will on the states to get the states to do what it wanted to do, and the court stepped in and said, you can't do that. There's a constant negotiation going on between the federal government and the state governments as to who has authority. Now, one last thing, and then we're done with federalism. There are two ways that the federal government can influence state policies. They can do it through what's called a categorical grant or a block grant. And I want to explain each of these and give an example. A categorical grant is money that's given for a specific purpose. Let me give you an example. An example of a categorical grant might be a grant that's given to the states specifically to hire teachers. Or a categorical grant can be a grant that's given specifically to build more classrooms. Or a categorical grant can be a grant that's designed specifically to bring broadband into schools. All three of those things pertain to education, but we call it a categorical grant because it identifies a specific category of spending. But it doesn't just have to pertain to education. A categorical grant might give a state money to improve their roads, or it might give money to improve their airports. It'll identify a specific area where the money has to be spent, and it has to be spent that way. Block grants are different. In a block grant, what the federal government does is it gives you money for a general purpose. So for example, building off of my previous examples, there might be a block grant given to a state for education. In the case of a block grant for education, it would be up to the state, and usually the governor, to decide, should we spend this on hiring more teachers? Should we spend this on building more classrooms? Should we spend this on bringing broadband into the schools? Or should we spend in a block grant having to do with transportation, should we spend this money on paving our roads, or should we spend this money on improving our airports? Now, if I ask this question on the exam, I will probably include the following. If you're the governor of a state, what would you prefer? A categorical grant or a block grant? And keep in mind, as you're thinking through this, the categorical grant requires you to spend money in a certain area. A block grant gives you the ability to decide where you want to spend that money in your specific state. Okay, and hopefully that was enough of a clue so that you know what the right answer is. That ends federalism. It can be a complicated topic because federalism is complicated. And it's one of the things that kind of makes federalism an interesting topic, at least for a political scientist, maybe not for you, depending on what your major is.